When a white mob boss laughed at him in broad daylight, the streets of Harlem went still. The echo of that cruel, dismissive chuckle rolled down the avenues like a challenge, a provocation aimed squarely at the man who had carved the neighborhood into his kingdom with blood, brains, and unyielding presence. People stopped in their tracks, sensing the weight of the moment. Eyes turned, conversations halted, even the sunlight seemed to hesitate. Bumpy Johnson, standing a few feet away, felt the laughter in his chest, felt it bounce off his calm exterior like a stone hitting steel. He didn't move, he didn't flinch. The legend never did. Around him, men shuffled uneasily, unsure whether to intervene or bow. The mob boss, confident in the entitlement of his whiteness and the arrogance of his power, leaned back in his chair, the smile of someone who thought himself untouchable curling at his lips. "You hear that, boys?" the mobster said, glancing at his men. "This little he began, only to be cut off by a single, sharp movement. Bumpy Johnson didn't raise his voice. He didn't scream. He simply stepped forward. And in that forward step, the room contracted, the air thickened, and every man present knew a reckoning had arrived. Bumpy's gaze locked with the mob boss's. There was no fear. There was no hesitation. Just the quiet, undeniable force of a man who had survived more threats, more bullets, and more betrayal than anyone could imagine, and who had done so not by luck, but by discipline, intelligence, and respect earned the hard way. "Your laughter," Bumpy said, slow, deliberate, "is a sound that will echo in regret if you don't learn its lesson." The room seemed to inhale. The mob boss's laughter faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease that he had never anticipated. He had assumed his wealth, his men, and his reputation could intimidate a man like Bumpy Johnson. He had been wrong. "Do you know who I am?" Bumpy continued. "Do you understand the streets you step into? The people you disrespect?" Silence. Not a single man moved. The weight of history, of Harlem's unspoken codes, pressed down like a physical force. Bumpy didn't have to raise a fist. He didn't have to shout. Every man in the room understood. The Godfather of Harlem had just set the terms. And in that single moment, the mob boss felt it. The first tremor of fear that would haunt him for the next 3 years. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't forget. Bumpy Johnson didn't forgive lightly, and Bumpy Johnson never, ever let humiliation go unanswered. Outside, the streets whispered the story. By the time dusk fell, Harlem knew. The audacity of the mob boss had been recorded, catalogued, and promised retribution. People went about their evening with a renewed sense of watchfulness. In the alleys, the jazz clubs, the corner stores, a silent acknowledgement passed from one face to another. The streets would remember. And Bumpy Johnson? He walked away with the calm of a man who had seen it all, survived it all, and had just planted the seeds of a reckoning so precise, so inevitable, that even time itself would bend toward his justice. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning. A 3-year countdown had started. Every insult, every chuckle, every act of dismissal was a thread in a tapestry of retribution that only Bumpy could weave. By the time the mob boss realized what was coming, the streets of Harlem and the legend of Bumpy Johnson would ensure that laughter turned into a plea for mercy. Bumpy Johnson was not born into privilege. He was born into the unforgiving streets of Harlem, a place where the difference between survival and ruin was measured in seconds, and respect was the only currency that mattered. By the time he reached adulthood, the name Bumpy was whispered in corners, nodded to in alleyways, and feared in boardrooms that dared to overlook him. He was a man who moved with precision, intelligence, and an understanding of power that most never acquired in a lifetime. The Harlem of Bumpy's era was a crucible. Jazz filled the air, yes, but so did danger. Poverty and prejudice, organized crime, and corrupt politicians all coexisted in a city that demanded resilience. Men fought not just for money, but for dignity, for territory, for survival. And Bumpy Johnson had mastered all three. He wasn't the loudest or the flashiest. He didn't rely solely on guns or muscle. His strength lay in knowledge, timing, and the unspoken authority he wielded over the community he both protected and commanded. He understood the streets better than anyone. Every corner store, every nightclub, every alley was mapped in his mind. He knew who could be trusted, who could be bought, and who could be broken. But more importantly, he understood that fear alone was fleeting. Respect, carefully earned and consistently enforced, was lasting. That was why he walked the line between lawlessness and order with such apparent ease. Those who tried to challenge him quickly learned that consequences in Harlem were inevitable, and sometimes surgical in their precision. Bumpy's reputation extended beyond Harlem's streets. Law enforcement and rival mobsters alike knew that while he could be bargained with, he could never be ignored. Corruption and loyalty danced around him, but he remained the constant, a man whose influence could bend outcomes not through chaos, but through strategy. When police officers attempted to intimidate him, when politicians tried to manipulate outcomes, or when rival gangsters laughed at him publicly, they miscalculated. They failed to understand the principle that defined Bumpy Johnson. A legend's patience was just as lethal as his action. The mob boss who laughed at him underestimated more than a man. He underestimated the legacy that Bumpy had already built. He underestimated the network of allies, friends, and informants who operated with Bumpy's guidance, ensuring that no insult went unnoticed. And he underestimated the inevitability of justice in a neighborhood where Bumpy's presence was law. Harlem itself was both battlefield and canvas. Every jazz club, speakeasy, and numbers operation was a node in a living, breathing city that respected hierarchy and feared disruption. Bumpy had not seized Harlem by force alone. He had cultivated it, stabilized it, and earned a degree of loyalty that was rare, even in a world accustomed to violence. People trusted him to keep the streets functioning, to enforce rules that benefited the community, and to punish those who disrupted balance. And balance, above all, was what the mob boss had threatened. His public mockery wasn't just a personal insult, it was a challenge to Bumpy's control, a test of authority. But the Godfather of Harlem had been tested many times before, and he had survived. He had endured betrayals, arrests, rival factions, and death threats. And he had emerged not just alive, but stronger, wiser, and more respected after every encounter. So when that laughter echoed across the room, it wasn't just a single insult, it was a spark thrown onto kindling. And Bumpy Johnson had the patience to let it smoulder, to wait, to plan, to set the stage for a reckoning so meticulous that 3 years later, the man who mocked him would remember nothing but fear. Harlem watched, quietly and intently. The legend walked among them. And the city knew, as it had for years, that when the Godfather's patience ended, consequences were swift, precise, and absolute. The mob boss didn't forget either. He spent the next months puffed up with arrogance, certain that time would erase the humiliation he'd felt in Harlem that day. He hosted dinners in dimly lit back rooms, laughing with his men about the audacity of a black man daring to confront him. But Harlem was never a city that forgot. Every insult, every sneer, every public mockery was catalogued, remembered, and never ignored. And Bumpy Johnson was a man who measured 3 years the way others measured minutes. The streets of Harlem felt the tension, even if most didn't know its source. Numbers runners and store owners whispered about the boss who had laughed at Bumpy, and while they went about their daily lives, the undercurrent was unmistakable. A reckoning was coming. The Godfather's allies were quietly preparing. His men surveyed the mob's movements, noting the weaknesses in their operations, the cracks in their armor. No one outside the inner circle knew the full plan. That was the genius of Bumpy Johnson. Patience was a weapon, and he wielded it like a surgeon. Meanwhile, the mob boss made miscalculations. He assumed Bumpy's patience was weakness. He assumed that time softened affronts. He continued to flaunt his wealth, his men, and his control in Harlem, unaware that with every public display of arrogance, he was planting the seeds of his own downfall. It wasn't just personal pride at stake. Bumpy understood the stakes on a broader scale. Harlem was his domain, and its respect was a currency he could not afford to devalue. If the mob boss's defiance went unchecked, it would signal to other rivals that Bumpy could be mocked with impunity. The consequences would ripple, not just in the streets, but in the numbers games, the clubs, the businesses that relied on the Godfather's oversight. And so, Bumpy watched. He didn't panic, he didn't act rashly. The city itself became his informant, feeding him whispers of deals, movements, and alliances. Every barbershop conversation, every street corner debate, every small scuffle added pieces to the puzzle. He catalogued every detail, stored every insult, and waited for the precise moment when action would be unavoidable and devastatingly effective. The mob boss, confident in his impunity, began to make public overtures to assert dominance. He sent men into Harlem, attempting to muscle in on numbers operations, to push independent dealers into paying protection money, to subtly flaunt that he was untouchable. The community watched with wary eyes, understanding that these were provocations and that the Godfather would respond. But no one could know when or how. Bumpy's inner circle understood. His lieutenants knew that preparation, patience, and intelligence were paramount. They mapped routes, identified key players, and ensured that the community would be protected, no matter what retaliation might come. Every move by the mob was recorded, catalogued, and analyzed. Every laugh, every boast, every gesture of contempt was fueling the fire that would eventually consume him. Even within the mob boss's own organization, unease began to creep in. Men whispered among themselves, noting the meticulous way Bumpy operated, the precision of his intelligence network, and the inevitability of consequence that seemed to hang over the city like a dark cloud. By the second year, the boss's confidence began to erode, not because of violence, but because of strategy, patience, and the inescapable weight of respect that Bumpy commanded. Harlem itself seemed to hold its breath. The tension was palpable in the jazz clubs, the corner stores, the alleyways. Everyone felt it, even those who didn't know the details. The Godfather was waiting. The streets knew it, and soon the man who had once laughed at Harlem's protector would learn that disrespect carried a cost, one that could not be avoided. The calm before the storm stretched for years, each day building the momentum of inevitability. The city watched silently, the legend of Bumpy Johnson growing with every calculated day of patience. And all the while, the mob boss remained blind to the truth. In Harlem, arrogance without caution is fatal, and a legend like Bumpy Johnson never forgets. 3 years had passed since the mob boss laughed in public, and Harlem had changed. Not just the streets, but the very air seemed charged with anticipation. Word of the impending reckoning had traveled through whispers and coded signals. The Godfather of Harlem was moving, and when he acted, it would be precise, calculated, and unavoidable. The city, loyal and watchful, held its collective breath. Bumpy Johnson had waited for this moment, measuring it like a master strategist. The mob boss had grown careless over time, emboldened by fleeting successes and the arrogance of wealth. He had underestimated patience, underestimated intelligence, and above all, underestimated the Godfather. Now, it was time to correct that error. The confrontation was set in a downtown Harlem club, a neutral ground known to both sides. The mob boss arrived with his men, laughing nervously, attempting to mask the tension in the room with bravado. Bumpy entered last, his presence commanding attention the instant he stepped through the door. He wore a tailored suit, clean lines, and a calm expression that belied the storm brewing beneath. Every eye turned toward him. Even the mob's enforcers felt the weight of his gaze, as though he were measuring each man for a verdict. The room went quiet, a silence so thick it seemed to absorb the smoke and music that normally filled the air. Bumpy's voice, low and deliberate, cut through it. "You remember me?" he asked, stepping closer to the man who had mocked him. 3 years ago, you laughed. You laughed at me, at Harlem, at the people who live and die in these streets. I want to make sure you understand. Laughter comes with consequences here." The mob boss chuckled nervously, his confidence faltering. "You think you can—" he began, but Bumpy raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "This isn't about thinking," Bumpy said. "It's about knowing. And I've spent 3 years knowing every move you've made, every step you've taken. You've tried to build an empire over these streets, but you've forgotten one thing. Respect isn't given. It's earned, and you owe it. To me, to Harlem, and you've run out of time." The mob boss tried to regain composure, but his eyes betrayed fear. Every man in the room could see it. The legend before them was no longer just a story. He was real. He was methodical. And he was in control. Bumpy's lieutenants flanked him not as guards, but as a subtle reminder. This confrontation was orchestrated, precise, and the streets were watching. Every corner of Harlem, from the jazz clubs to the corner stores, would know the outcome. The room felt smaller as Bumpy stepped closer. His gaze never wavered, his calm unshakable. He didn't strike, he didn't shout, but in his presence, the mob boss felt the crushing weight of inevitability. "You've humiliated yourself and your organization for 3 years," Bumpy continued. "And for what? Money? Pride? Control? None of that matters if you forget the people whose lives you disrupt." The mob boss swallowed hard, the bravado gone. I want peace," he said, almost whispering. "I'm willing to negotiate." Bumpy paused, studying him, weighing the sincerity in those words against the arrogance he had seen for 3 long years. The silence stretched, thick and tense. Then Bumpy finally spoke. "You'll have peace," he said slowly, "but it comes with conditions. Respect Harlem, respect the people who live here, respect me, and never forget that actions have consequences. You've learned that now. Let this be the last time you test it." The mob boss nodded quickly, relief and fear mingling in equal measure. He realized in that moment that the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. He was no longer laughing. He was bargaining for survival in the city he had once thought he could dominate. Outside the club, Harlem's pulse was electric. Word would spread quickly. The community knew that the Godfather had acted without violence, yet his authority had never been clearer. Respect had been enforced, dignity restored, and a dangerous rival humbled without bloodshed. For Bumpy Johnson, this was the pinnacle of strategy, a confrontation so controlled, so precise, that the outcome reinforced not only his personal power, but the structure of the community itself. The streets had witnessed history, and it would be remembered for decades. The mob boss left the club humbled, his organization unsettled. They had underestimated Harlem, underestimated the Godfather, and underestimated patience. The lesson was written into the fabric of the neighborhood. Arrogance, disrespect, and laughter at the wrong man had consequences. And those consequences were inevitable when Bumpy Johnson was involved. And as Bumpy stepped back into the streets he commanded, calm and composed, the people of Harlem saw a man who had turned insult into strategy, laughter into leverage, and disrespect into an enduring lesson. Every corner, every club, every store owner understood. The Godfather of Harlem didn't react in haste. He waited, he planned, and when the time was right, he acted. The legend had not only survived a personal insult, it had transformed it into a masterclass of authority, respect, and power. The city would not forget. The mob boss would not forget. And history would record in unflinching detail how the audacity of one man's arrogance collided with the calculated patience of a legend and lost. The aftermath of that night rippled through Harlem like a storm that had passed, leaving clarity in its wake. The mob boss, once brimming with arrogance, now moved with caution. Every decision, every deal, every word was measured. He had laughed at Bumpy Johnson 3 years ago, thinking the Godfather of Harlem was a man to be mocked, ignored, or pushed aside. By the time he left that club, he was a man who understood the price of miscalculation. In the streets, the word spread swiftly. From the jazz clubs to the corner stores, from the numbers operators to the taxi drivers, everyone knew the outcome. There had been no gunfire, no chaos, no public spectacle. But the lesson was as clear as if a cannon had fired. Harlem's protector had acted. Respect had been enforced. Authority had been defined, once again, without a single unnecessary casualty. Bumpy Johnson's approach to justice had always been deliberate. Violence was a tool, not a crutch. And on this night, he proved that control and intelligence could deliver consequences sharper than any weapon. The mob boss and his men would be cautious for years, fearful of missteps, aware that every insult, every slight could be met with the same precision and patience. The community, meanwhile, reacted with a mixture of relief and awe. Parents felt safer, knowing that a man capable of commanding respect on such a scale was watching over the neighborhood. Business owners understood that the rules of engagement were enforced consistently and predictably, and the younger men, the boys who would grow up to navigate Harlem's streets themselves, saw a lesson that could not be taught in schools. Dignity, patience, and strategy are more powerful than brute force. Bumpy's lieutenants, those who had been in the room that night, and those who had worked quietly behind the scenes for 3 years, recognized the brilliance of their leader. He had turned an insult into a long-term strategic victory. He had transformed a moment of public humiliation into a demonstration of absolute authority, ensuring that no rival, white, black, or otherwise, would underestimate him again. Even law enforcement and other organized crime figures took notice. There was no headline-grabbing bloodshed, no chaos to condemn. Instead, there was the quiet assertion of power, a reminder that the Godfather of Harlem did not need to react impulsively. He controlled the narrative, he controlled the streets, and in doing so, he protected the delicate ecosystem of the neighborhood he ruled, not with fear alone, but with earned respect and undeniable presence. As for the mob boss, he retreated to his offices and private clubs with a new reality weighing heavily on him. Every contact, every deal in Harlem required careful negotiation. His men began to question his judgment. Whispers circulated about his vulnerability. He had been humiliated, yes, but in a way that ensured he would never again challenge Bumpy directly without fear. The consequences were not only strategic, but psychological. A man who once laughed in public at a legend now walked through Harlem with caution, aware that the city itself could turn against him. The streets he had once assumed were his to exploit were now monitored, measured, and protected by a mind sharper than his own, guided by a presence more commanding than his bravado. Harlem's faith in Bumpy Johnson only grew. People saw a man who could convert insult into leverage, who could outthink and outmaneuver those who dared to disrespect him. They recognized that the Godfather's greatest power wasn't the muscle he could deploy, but the intelligence, patience, and strategic brilliance he brought to every challenge. The community learned that justice was not always a spectacle. It could be quiet, calculated, and absolute. By the end of that week, the streets hummed with stories of the mob boss's retreat, his caution, and his newfound respect. But more importantly, they hummed with respect for Bumpy Johnson. His name was no longer just a legend in whispered tales. It was a force, tangible and unassailable. Every insult he had endured, every slight he had absorbed, had been transformed into a victory that preserved the balance of Harlem and reinforced his authority over the streets. And as the jazz played softly in the background and the lights of the neighborhood glimmered against the night sky, Bumpy Johnson walked the streets with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had proven once again that the Godfather of Harlem commanded more than fear. He commanded respect, and that respect, earned over years of trials, patience, and confrontation, was absolute. Years later, the streets of Harlem still remembered that moment, not for the violence, but for the lesson. Bumpy Johnson had turned what could have been a fleeting insult into an enduring legend. The mob boss, once a figure of arrogance and defiance, had become a cautionary tale, and the community, the city itself, understood in a way that could not be erased. In Harlem, respect was not requested. It was demanded, protected, and enforced by those who truly understood power. The legacy of that confrontation extended beyond a single man's humiliation. It redefined the balance of authority in Harlem. Rival gangs, both local and external, knew that any attempt to challenge the Godfather would be met with the same patience, precision, and inevitability. Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated that a legend's power was not measured by the size of his army or the volume of his threats, but by the intelligence behind his strategy and the courage to let the world witness the consequence of disrespect. For decades, this event became a benchmark in Harlem's history. Parents told their children the story not as a tale of violence, but as a lesson in respect, patience, and intelligence. Aspiring street leaders learned that to rise, one must first understand the intricate dance of influence, alliances, and timing. And law enforcement officers, mobsters, and politicians alike recognized that Bumpy Johnson's authority was not to be underestimated. The mob boss never fully recovered from the encounter. Even years later, whispers of the event followed him, shaping every decision he made. Every public move was shadowed by the memory of the Godfather's calm authority, his patience that spanned 3 years, and the inevitability of consequence. It was a demonstration of power that left an indelible mark, not through chaos, but through precision. Harlem itself flourished under the protection of Bumpy's influence. The neighborhoods once riddled with unrestrained conflict began to feel the effects of his careful oversight. Numbers operations, local businesses, and community organizations operated under the unspoken rule that balance was maintained and disrespect would not be tolerated. The streets became a proving ground for character, intelligence, and loyalty rather than brute force alone. In historical terms, this moment solidified Bumpy Johnson's status not just as a criminal figure, but as a protector of Harlem. His intelligence, strategy, and patience created a structure of power that outlasted any one individual or organization. He was no longer merely feared, he was revered, a symbol of authority whose influence shaped not only the streets, but the hearts and minds of the people. For historians and storytellers alike, the episode of the mob boss's laughter and his eventual humiliation stands as a defining moment in the legend of Harlem's Godfather. It was proof that a true leader doesn't need to strike first, shout the loudest, or wield the largest gun. Leadership, authority, and legacy are cultivated over time, nurtured through patience, respect, and an unerring understanding of human nature. And Bumpy Johnson had mastered it all. Walking through Harlem after the confrontation, the godfather of the neighborhood remained calm, unassuming, and deliberate. But every glance, every word, every decision reinforced the truth. The streets were his domain, and respect once earned was absolute. The laughter of a fool could not undo decades of strategy. Disrespect could be transformed into a story of triumph, a lesson written into the very fabric of the city. Bumpy Johnson's legend was cemented not in violence alone, but in the orchestration of justice, the careful calibration of consequence, and the unshakable authority that only patience and intelligence could produce. Harlem remembered, the streets remembered, and history would remember that the godfather of Harlem had once been laughed at and emerged victorious, unshaken, and immortalized in the city's soul. This wasn't just a story of insult and retaliation, it was a story of patience, intelligence, and the kind of authority that could reshape a city without firing a single shot. When the mob boss laughed at Bumpy Johnson in public, he assumed power could be challenged with arrogance alone. What he did not understand, and what Harlem would never forget, was that true respect cannot be mocked, bought, or stolen. It must be earned, defended, and, when necessary, enforced with precision. Bumpy Johnson had taught the city a lesson that would echo for decades. Respect is not a currency to be squandered. Power is not a show to be flaunted. And patience, when wielded by a legend, is a weapon more devastating than any gun, more persuasive than any threat, and more permanent than any reputation built on fear. The godfather of Harlem walked the streets as quietly as he had always moved, yet every step carried the weight of consequence. The people understood it. The rival organizations understood it. And the historical record, written in whispers, headlines, and recollections of those who lived through it, recognized it. This wasn't just about one man's pride or revenge. This was about a community's dignity, about the invisible structures that held a neighborhood together, and about the way a single individual could shape the moral and practical order of an entire city. The laughter that once echoed through a Harlem club became a silence that spoke louder than any gunshot. Legends are not built on fear alone. They are built on respect, strategy, and the courage to act when the moment is right. And Bumpy Johnson, once mocked, now triumphant, reminded the world that authority is earned. Insults have consequences, and the streets will always remember those who protect them. In the end, Harlem's Godfather did more than survive an insult. He transformed it into a story, a lesson, and a legend. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world exactly what respect really means.